Hello, good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing okay after lunch. I know this tends to be the time where everyone loses your energy a bit, so rest assured I won't be offended if you're feeling a little tired. I'm the lucky one who gets to stand in the front of the room, and also I'm half a pint through cold brew here, so if I seem jittery, that's why. Anyway, my name is MikeBiFulco. I'm a developer advocate at Stripe. Today we're talking about building Markdoc, which is a powerful, flexible, open source Markdown framework that Stripe has developed. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. I'm going to give you some background first, and I'll try and leave some time at the end for questions and any other, as we go along, if you have questions along the way, try and keep those in mind, and we'll try and get to them at the end. I'll also be around afterwards for a few minutes if you want to chat too. So at any rate, this is me. Like I said, my name is MikeBiFulco. You can chase me down on Twitter at IrreverentMike. I share a lot of my Stripe work there. I share some of the projects I work on my own, some of the other things that I do. I'm also a fortunate North Carolina native, so I live down the block a few hours away in Charlotte. I see some North Carolina folks nodding their heads in the crowd. If you're ever in Charlotte, hit me up. I'd love to come and hang out. Apart from working at Stripe, there are a few things that I do that are interesting about me that might be interesting to you. I'm always up for a good cup of coffee, which is funny given what I started my chat with here a minute ago. I'm also really into cycling. During the pandemic, I started gravel cycling kind of every day to keep myself sane, and I've turned that down a little bit in recent days, but I'll talk your ear off about these things if you don't find Markdoc interesting, so we can always talk about that too. So we're here at All Things Open, talking about open source. Our amazing, gracious hosts here hosting the event are incredible. I've been a fortunate benefactor and benefiter, whatever, of open source for quite a while. I'm really, really fond of open source. And I've worked on open source projects in various capacities for the past couple of years. I figured I would kind of start this talk with my bona fides to give you some sense of the things that I've worked on. I am co-founder and maintainer of a site called APIs You Won't Hate. APIs You Won't Hate is it's the largest community online of API developers. We have a Slack channel with a few thousand API devs and designers. We have a blog, we have a newsletter, we have a podcast, we do videos, we do tools, we do all sorts of things. It's all open source. It's all meant to benefit the public. We try and keep that up and running so that people who are interested in building APIs can come and benefit from the public source that we've built. And I should also sort of couch this in the caveat that my role in APIs You Won't Hate is as a front-end developer. So I'm generally not an API designer. I'm the consumer of APIs. And I ask the uncomfortable questions about how do I use this, or what does this all mean? And I get to work with some really smart people as a result of that. Would love to chat with you about this. APIsYouWon'tHate.com is the website for that. This is also my alma mater, if you will. Gymnasium is a free online code school for creatives who are looking to dabble in things on the web. So if you or someone you know is like a copywriter or an illustrator, or someone who isn't directly someone who writes code but is interested in learning to write code, Gymnasium is a fully open source code school. So there's free online self-paced video courses for people who want to learn those things. I was technical director for Gymnasium for a number of years. And actually when I was working there, I started Twitch streaming. So every Tuesday afternoon, I would essentially just Twitch stream and open up my desktop to the world and share whatever I was working on, because everything we did there was open source. There were no secrets. And one of the things I liked about that the most is that when you're streaming dev work, you're not doing sort of traditional developer tutorials. You're showing people like all the ways that you mess up and all the struggles that you have as you're doing things, as opposed to the happy path from A to B. Gymnasium is great. I no longer work there, but was previously affiliated with them. Recommend it to anyone who's interested in learning this kind of stuff. I also publish under my own site, the eponymous MikeBiFulco.com. I publish articles, newsletters, and a podcast about React stuff, about open source stuff, about my philosophy for work and living a meaningful life, and generally try and keep this open source as well. So the whole source code for this is available. That's built on top of React and Next.js. I should have mentioned before that the APIs You Won't Hate site is also React and Next.js, although in the past it was Gatsby, before that it was Jekyll, before that it was something else. We've had a dozen different implementations. I've used that essentially as an excuse to learn new ways to do things over the years. One more final plug for myself. I have been publishing a newsletter of late. A nice pregnant pause so you can really take in the link that I've shared on the screen. This is where I've been kind of sharing my thoughts on dev stuff lately with folks. I've been doing a series on design for developers. So if you're a developer that's ever said to yourself, hey, I really wish I could make things look better, I've been kind of sharing basic heuristics and rules for developers to do designy things to make your whatever it is you're building look a little better and be a little more digestible for end users. So that's kind of some of my background, personal projects and open source things that I do outside of my day-to-day at Stripe. I also work on open source things at Stripe. So we have a whole open source team. They're amazing. They do incredible work. We have a number of projects on GitHub and elsewhere. This is stripe.dev. This is essentially our sort of jumping off point, our landing page for developers who want to do integrations with Stripe. This is open source. At the moment, this is the rare website online that is just HTML and CSS. There's no magic there. It's in a open source repo. You can go check it out. We do have plans for this, which sort of parlays into what we're going to talk about today. I should probably step back a little bit and give you background on Stripe first. So we like to say at Stripe we're building sort of the financial infrastructure for the internet. So Stripe builds tools and products for companies of all sizes, from sort of Fortune 500 companies to small and medium businesses to startups to individual creator type businesses, individual proprietor things, to help connect your revenue to your product, whether it's an information product or a SaaS company, or if you're building a bank, anything inside of that giant sort of space, we have a myriad of products for. And as a necessity, it's kind of a complicated series of products to provide documentation for, which is where the background for today's talk comes from. If we rewind about 10 years, this is what Stripe.com used to look like. It was pretty simple. I pulled up the Internet Archive Wayback Machine and went to October of, I think it was, October of 2012. Pretty straightforward landing page. It really looks like the internet in 2012, which might be a fond memory for some of us, or a hated memory for others, I guess. Payments for developers was the pitch at that point, and it was a fairly simple set of APIs. I was not at Stripe that long ago. I actually should probably also say I've been at Stripe since March of this year. So some of the story that I'll be telling you today predates me, and it's kind of been my forensic gathering of information from my colleagues at Stripe about what's happened in the sort of intervening time. So this was Stripe.com in 2012. This was Stripe's docs in 2012. If any of you have used Stripe in the recent months, it looks a little different from this now, but you can see there's a lot of stuff going on here. So early on, Stripe's products included payments, stuff for collecting payments with cards. We had some subscription things. It's a little small on the screen here. There was webhooks stuff. There was billing and testing and an API reference, all those sorts of things that were on our docs pages. And if we take this and then we fast forward to 2022, where we are today, this is what Stripe.com looks like. It has grown a little bit in design and complexity and the amount of information that's there. This is the list of products that Stripe builds, and actually this is only one pane of the many lists of products that Stripe puts out into the world. And so as you can imagine, the complexity of the site has grown fairly significantly. There's a lot of things we offer to a lot of companies and developers of different sizes. And with that, our docs have grown quite a bit. I recognize that this is a little small and maybe blurry on the screen here. I'll kind of walk through this in segments here to describe what's going on. But this is Stripe's docs. I'd imagine some of you have probably seen this before in some capacity. I'll sort of blur it out and go through one at a time. On the left side is the navigation of the various products that Stripe offers. So this is the documentation pages that are separate from the API reference. So this isn't like going through the APIs available for Ruby developers, for example. This is like, what are the use cases I can fulfill using Stripe's products? I've highlighted here the subscriptions product and building a subscriptions integration, the very basic steps of that. There are many, many things on this left navigation. They are sort of ever-changing as we add and update products. On the central part of this is the actual steps that you would follow to get these things done. So if you have a job to be done, this is where you find the information for that. An interesting thing to point out here that's a little bit blurry is this big purplish blue thing in the center here is code instructions for how to do things. We provide those instructions for our products in 7 different languages. So there's Ruby and Python and PHP and Java and Node and Go and .NET. We also do iOS and Android. We also do React Native. So like if you imagine this as a matrix of things we need to provide documentation for, already we've got a ton of products, a ton of languages, and actually a couple different platforms. So we have this sort of code-first stuff that my developer friends love. We have a no-code set of instructions for a lot of our products where you can get a lot of things done with no code. There's sort of intermediary things that you can get done with Stripe's dashboard and some code and kind of everything in between. So that's a couple of facets already. We've got products, we've got languages, we've got, is it no code, is it code first? To add more complexity still to that, we do our docs in a bunch of different languages. So this is a growing list of languages that docs are supported in. You can pivot your language based on what you're sort of native to reading. And in addition to that, Stripe supports a lot of different locales for where we take payments. So we support developers in a growing list of 47 countries around the world. And what you select here impacts the documentation that's shared on the page. So For example, in the United States, there are different payment methods available to users than in Japan, where there are localized payment methods that we don't use here. We tend to use credit cards and cash and maybe bank transfers for certain types of things. In Japan, they have a lot of really interesting systems that have developed culturally around paying with vouchers at convenience stores, and bank transfers might be more common in some locales than others. Buy now and pay later things are more common in some places. So this pivot affects that too. So now we've got products, languages, we've got no code versus some code, we've got what language do you want to see it in, and what country, what region generally are you interested in, which we've gone from a matrix to like a double time cube of complexity of things that we sort of deliver our documentation on. This is a zoom in on just a fragment of one of the code samples in the docs. So this is showing node instructions for setting up a checkout session. And what I've highlighted here is a little hard to see, kind of draw a box around it there. We also provide dynamic content within the docs. So if you have an account with Stripe, you pull up the documentation, it'll show you your API key sort of in situ in code samples that we provide. And this is dynamic, so this will be different for me versus you. If I have two different accounts, it'll show different API keys for those accounts. And so you can imagine trying to deliver documentation pages that do all of this has a bit of complexity involved in it, and it's a lot to maintain. In short, there's a lot there, right? You can imagine the task of building a system that does that is pretty complicated, and there's a lot that goes into it. And to be fair, this has grown over time. This was not what Stripe's docs looked like on day one. Although some of the content that is there started out on day one, or in early days, and are things that we've tried to persist. So sliding back in time a little bit, the very early days of Stripe documentation were built on top of Ruby on Rails, using Ruby's ERB templating system. It looks a little bit like this. I grabbed this sample almost exactly from Rails documentation. So this isn't actually from Stripe's code base. This is from, I think, the Git repo for ERB. It looks a little bit like handlebars, mustache, some of those templating things you've probably seen. Although it's very Ruby flavored, there are things you can do like evaluate expressions and things like that that are really nice for Ruby devs. This is what Stripe's docs were built on for a long time, a sort of customization of ERB templates built on top of a Rails app. We learned quite a bit from this experience. So there were good things and bad things here. Building a page with ERB first meant that the pages were all individualized views of a Rails app. So you had full-on access to everything within Ruby on the page. All the data models from the Ruby context were there. The Ruby namespaces were available, so you could do things like run calculations on date times, or pull in Ruby's math functionalities, whatever sort of utilities you might want to use on the page. You can imagine, as a technical writer, that's a really nice thing to be able to have. Hey, I want to be able to show what happens, to a subscription 6 months from now. I can calculate that date dynamically. That's a super cool thing to be able to do. That is also what let us have these dynamic code examples that had API keys built into them. We would also surface like product information. If you had a product in your dashboard, we could show that as a sample in the documentation so that you could kind of relate to what the APIs would do from the docs pages. The downsides of this is that it was hard to scale. So it became really challenging to maintain this thing as it grew, as Stripe's lists of products grew, as the teams that were maintaining this thing grew. If you've worked with technical writing teams in the past, typically they are fairly technical people, often from a developer background, although sometimes not. They are generally really good at doing the translation task of thinking about what a developer needs and explaining it in human terms, which is a kind of a challenging thing. A bit similar to if you're familiar with user experience, it's a bit like that, where you kind of need to translate from one to the other. The downside, or the challenge of working with technical writers for something like this, is that they don't want to write code. So technical writers are really focused on delivering meaningful content to you, and having our technical writers go into an ERB page and have to build out the Ruby template with interpolation and all those things was more complicated than necessary for technical writers. A couple of the other bullets here, complicated pages, as they grew, they got more complex. They were very fragile and sort of easily broken. So if you omitted a close tag on some of these pages, it could break the view and cause it to crash and give you a 500. They were hard to debug. The tooling for debugging ERB stuff early on wasn't great. The debugger stuff available wasn't as good as it needed to be to manage something this complicated. And because these docs pages were maintained by different teams at Stripe working on different products, and as technical writers came and went, each page was sort of implemented differently based on the tastes or the approach that a given technical writer / developer would take to write these things. It wasn't great. It was hard to scale, and adding a page, updating a page felt different depending on where you were within the docs. So there was a project that went underway to find a new approach to this, to rebuild Stripe's docs stuff. And again, this predates me a bit at Stripe, so some of this is information I pulled from talking to a number of my colleagues. But the goal here was to take what we learned from this experience and come up with a new framework and a new platform for developing a documentation site for our public-facing docs that was easy for our devs to use, and also easy for the technical writers to use, so that writers could do the writing things that they're sort of tasked with doing, and developers could maintain their writing really well. At the same time, we didn't want to lose some of the functionality that was there. So generally speaking, the goals kind of looked like this. We wanted to pull in a new architecture that took our past experiences, took the good things from the old system and kept them around. Also got rid of the bad things, obviously. We wanted to make debugging things easier for developers. For technical writers, if something went wrong, we wanted to have an easier system for them to understand. We wanted, generally speaking, the DevX, the developer experience for both writers and developers to be easier. And we wanted to maintain that dynamic nature of things. So you can imagine a world where this got too complicated and we just ripped out all the dynamic stuff. There was no longer API keys being injected or products from your dashboard being injected, just for the sake of maintainability as Stripe's products got more and more complicated. But that was a really important feature because it created a lot of trust and attachment with devs as they were creating implementation with Stripe stuff. In addition to that, we wanted to separate the content side of things from the Ruby logic side of things, but we wanted to keep the Ruby dynamic cool stuff that was built into the system. So that meant that we wanted to use Sorbet, which is a type system for Ruby. We wanted to have static analysis of types, which was sort of a developing thing in the intervening years. We wanted all of the Ruby stuff to be in Ruby land, meaning if you were writing Ruby code, you were just writing Ruby code and not commingling that with technical documentation, like things like headings and links to other pages and whatnot. And we wanted the content stuff to live in a different place from the Ruby stuff within the underlying repos that manage this code. So the asterisk there is that we still wanted the Ruby goodness. Like we wanted it to be separate, but wanted to be able to take advantage of Ruby stuff as needed. So there were a number of products that went underway, a number of projects that were underway to explore this. And what ended up happening, as I'm sure you've experienced in the past, is that a bunch of different people tried to solve this problem. Some things worked, some didn't. Some got sort of merged into the existing story, and some got shot down for various reasons. And through the sort of meandering history of this, what we sort of landed on was that there's a really good developer experience for technical writers, or a technical writer experience, if you will, that's familiar to a lot of people that I'd imagine you've probably all seen before, Markdown. Actually, out of curiosity, if you haven't used Markdown, can you raise your hand? Okay, fair enough. So Markdown is a templating language for writing really simplified HTML from essentially readable documentation. So if you look at a Markdown page, it kind of looks like maybe a code terminal window that's not very fancy. It's not necessarily formatted out of the gate. But what you get from Markdown is a really, really finite set of rules for what you can put on a page. You get headings, you get links, you get bullets, you get a couple of other things, and the bells and whistles of HTML, like you're not going to be able to make a blink tag with Markdown, things like that, right? In fact, this is what Markdown looked like. In the process of researching for this talk, I found out that Markdown was invented in 2004. By John Gruber over at Daring Fireball. I knew he was the sort of progenitor of Markdown. I did not know it started in 2004. But essentially, this is what the proposal for Markdown looked like. It was, funny enough, written in Markdown. Super cool. It goes into, actually, if you go and read it, there's lots of like, this supports, the Mac OS terminal command line from like OS 9 before OS X came out, and all these things that are just like, okay, well, we don't make these assumptions about Markdown anymore, but it's really interesting to read the context of the project as it came around. So to bring a long story back around, we wanted to adopt Markdown as the authoring environment for our technical writers while maintaining dynamic content without having to have our technical writers write a bunch of Ruby code to do dynamic things in their technical documentation, and also sort of trying to minimize the amount of repeated code that they wrote. So what we landed on is the product that we have today called Markduck. Markduck is an open source project. It was created by Ryan Paul, one of my colleagues. His Twitter handle is Segfault. I'll read it out because it's a little small here. Segpault. You should all go follow him. He was going to come hang out with us today, but ended up not being able to come this week. Markdoc was a project that Ryan started as a proof of concept. He developed it over a couple of days. brought it in to kind of show colleagues like, hey, this is the idea I have for doing this thing a little better than what we have. And as sort of happens sometimes, that proof of concept was taken and built into this project that we have today. So he didn't actually intend for this to be like the end solution, but it grew into what we're using. There's a tremendous blog post on the story of Markdoc, which you should go and read. I have a link to this at the end of the talk here. I also should have said at the beginning of this, I have the slides will be made available to you. It's in a GitHub repo. I'll share that link at the end as well. This blog post is really cool. It's interesting to hear the history of it, all the complexity that goes into it. Ryan is a very talented technical writer and actually was a journalist as well. Has a lot of experience writing in a lot of different capacities, and so this is a problem that comes from, or a solution that comes from solving problems that he's experienced in a bunch of different capacities in his career. This is sort of cribbed from the landing page for Markdoc, which is markdoc.dev. Essentially, what Markdoc is an expansion of Markdown syntax. It's sort of a superset of Markdown, which is a framework that lets you extend it for creating dynamic documentation sites. It's meant to be friendly for devs and for writers, and it's more than just documentation. So although it was designed for building docs sites, it's something that is applicable to sort of anywhere where you want to write content, deliver something to the web based in Markdown. And have some sort of dynamic stuff. So you could build doc sites with it. You could set up a personal blog. You could do a news site, all sorts of things where this is applicable, sort of so long as your authoring audience is comfortable writing in Markdown and your developer audience is building something that's kind of compatible with Markdoc. The output of Markdoc is documentation, or well, essentially web content that runs through the React rendering library. So React needs to be a part of the picture, but React is very flexible in the sense that you could have various backends that feed into React. It's all JavaScript based. So I want to talk a little bit about how to use Markdoc, give you kind of the background on the core concepts of using it, where it differs from Markdown, where it overlaps, and what the experience of using it is like. It breaks down into a few core concepts. So these are, this is the sort of vernacular, the terminology as is defined by Markdoc. You'll see this stuff in the documentation site for Markdoc. It's really easy to go over, and it's something that once you kind of digest, it makes a lot of sense. So nodes in Markdoc parlance are all of the things that Markdown does by default. So the nice syntax for headings with a pound sign and a space is an H1, 2 pound signs is an H2, and so on. You get bold and italic and links and images and lists and all those things in there. It supports those out of the gate as nodes. When you're building a Markdoc site, you can extend nodes, so you can customize the way they render on your site. A good example of that actually is if you have a site where you have headings that are rendered with an ID on them so that you can link to subparts of your pages, you can extend what that node looks like so that it doesn't include just an H1 tag with some text in it, it's an H1 tag with an ID and some text in it. Tags in Markdoc speak are essentially embeddable custom bits of syntax that lets you create reusable components. So it's a lot like a React component or a Vue component or any of the sort of modern web frameworks where you have composable things. The syntax looks like this. It's a bit like liquid tags. You can see kind of in here if and else are built into the framework, so you get if and else and a few other tags out of the gate. Callout is an example of a custom tag that you could create for yourself. So if you wanted to have something that's like a pull quote on your site that's styled in a certain way, you could create a call out tag like that and feed a type into it and customize the way that it's displayed on your site. And I should say type in the sense of web stuff, not TypeScript stuff in that sense. So it's essentially like an attribute, which is actually the next thing here. So when you create a custom tag with Markdoc, you can feed into it attributes of various JavaScript types. That includes Boolean, you can have numbers, you can have strings, you can have arrays, you can have objects, and any sort of combination of those things. So this is a really good example of a city. This is, if you wanted to render something that showed a city on your page, you could populate it with San Francisco and a bunch of things about San Francisco, and it would show you whatever your renderer for that city tag does. If we wanted to change this to Raleigh, you would change the name to Raleigh and all the associated metadata with that. The idea being that you could populate this from your backend, feed it into the Markdoc engine for however many cities you have, and suddenly you have a reusable bit of code that renders cities that all look the same with whatever attributes are supplied. Variables should be pretty similarly familiar. So this is, you can set variables in your bits of Markdoc if you want to do something that requires a calculation on a Markdoc page. They're referenceable pretty easily with a $ within these sort of brace and percent tags. I should also say too, one of the things that's built in out of the gate is front matter. If you're familiar with Markdown, front matter are the attributes that you embed at the top of a file, separated by 3 hyphens in between the top and bottom of the file. Those are referenceable within the page as well. Functions are the next bit. So this is a custom bit of calculation. So this is another case where out of the box, there's quite a few functions that are built into Markdoc. Equals is a good example of that. There's and or, so you can do those sorts of Boolean operations on things. They all look like this, so and, if you wanted to do and, replace the word equals there with and it would do an and comparison, return a true or false based on the inputted values. There are a few that come with Markdoc out of the box. You can also create custom ones. So this is an example of creating an uppercase function, which takes a string, converts it to all uppercase, and returns it. The way you do this is by creating a transform function. So the transform function in there is a pretty basic bit of JavaScript. It takes in some parameters, grabs the very first parameter, and converts it to uppercase if it's a string, returns that uppercase string, and anytime you use uppercase, it will render an uppercase string there. So you create your custom function like the top bit there, feed it into the config, which I'll explain in a minute here. That Markdoc then knows about that config, and whenever you go to render your Markdoc, any of these functions that you want to use are available anywhere where you've fed that into the config. So validation is also a part of the picture too. And this is useful if you're building a complex system where you want to have good control of the types of things that are rendered on a site. You want to make sure your technical writers aren't creating a tag that does something that's unexpected or includes a value that they're not supposed to use. The notion here essentially is that you can check what values are provided to a given attribute on a custom tag. So in this case, we're checking the type supplied to this custom banner component to make sure it's one of warning or info or error. You supply this sort of expected JavaScript object to describe the custom banner thing. You feed it in this attributes thing in the config, and under that is the type, that's what we're looking for. It's a string. It is required, so if this banner doesn't have a type supplied, it will return an error. If you supply a type that's not warning or info or error, it will also return an error. And you supply that validation to your config, and it will check when you parse your Markdoc to see if anything that was supplied is invalid. This is an optional step. You don't need to do this, but it is useful and very usable if it's something that you require. So the next step is rendering. So rendering is sort of what separates Markdoc from systems like MDX, if you used MDX before, which is sort of a React-specific extension of Markdown. MDX kind of obfuscates some of this process from you, where it takes in some Markdown, does some stuff to it, and returns usable React code. That's essentially what's happening here. Is you're feeding in some Markdown, feeding in Markdoc, and we go through this rendering process to parse it and make that available to your rendering engine. However, there are 3 steps in this process, so this parsing, transforming, and rendering steps that are all available to you as a developer. So, for example, that validation step that we talked about actually happens right after parsing. So you parse your content, you validate your content. If it fails there, then you don't need to pass it to the transform and render sections. This is also useful because there are various modes for rendering. So in the example I'll show here in a minute, we're using the React engine for rendering. But because this is an open source project, you could imagine building several different render APIs for this. So if you wanted to render to a Chrome OS view or something like that, or a React Native view or an iOS app, something like that, you can plug into this rendering engine, take the output of the transform function, and render it in something that's native to whatever platform you're on. So assembling all of those things together, this is a very, very basic sort of hello world for React with Markdoc. I'll kind of walk through it from the top to the bottom. You can grab this code and copy and paste it into a code pen and it'll run. You may not have seen this sort of syntax at the top where I'm importing from an ES module. This is just so that it'll run on CodePen. If you're running in a local project, you could use npm to install these dependencies. But in this case, we're using React. We're using React DOM and the Markdoc library. Those are all the dependencies here. The doc line there is just a bit of, it's a string that has some Markdown included in it. You create a config object, which in this case we're going with the bare minimum, which is just an empty object. And then you go through the 3 rendering steps. So you create an AST abstract syntax tree by parsing the Markdoc from your input at doc. You then take that tree and transform it into the content on the page by passing in a config. This is where if you wanted to have custom tags or custom functions or any of those things that we went through before, you would supply those to the config. And then once you've got the content out of that, you render it using a Markdoc renderer function. In this case, we're using the React renderer. We're passing in the React object, as well as the content that was created by the transform function, and then passing that into React's render stuff. So the last 2 lines there are pretty boilerplate React code for rendering something to an HTML page. It grabs an element in the DOM with an ID of root, renders the React to that element. So this is a super basic example, but it applies to lots of different platforms. Our documentation is pretty broad on trying to not make assumptions about where you're doing this, but we do have some specific examples of implementations and sort of choices you can make and customizations that are available. Again, there's a lot here. This is the Markdoc.dev site. Funny enough, it's also built with Markdoc because it's a documentation site, so you can actually go see how this thing is built by going to GitHub and checking out the source code for it. But this particular page shows how to implement this for Next.js. So I had actually planned to show a Next.js demo today of how you would incorporate Markdoc into a Next site, and then Next went and released a new major revision like Friday, which this will still work for. To be perfectly honest, you can go run all these directions and your Next site will work. But it doesn't take advantage of all the new stuff that Next just released, so I figured I would sort of can that demo for now. But we have instructions for doing this with Next. We have instructions for doing it with HTML, and just for like a Create React app React site. And because this is an open source project, contributions are welcome. If you want to show how to do this with something, in addition to that, Gatsby, some of those other projects that are static site generators with React, you could do that. If you wanted to build out a custom renderer for something like React Native or some of those things, contributions are welcome here as well. Again, just kind of hammering home that this is open source. So github.com/Markdoc is the sort of organization where all the Markdoc stuff lives. There's a Markdoc repo under that. There's a Markdoc docs site under that, a bunch of those things where contributions are always welcome. We're really interested in hearing what things you might want to try to do with this. We have folks who've built their own sort of personal sites with them, blogs built with this, docs sites built with this, all sorts of things that are taking these concepts and kind of extending them to custom use cases for developing themed sites or sites that do different dynamic stuff than what we do at Stripe, or extending this or finding sort of new and creative ways to use it. Also, obviously, by the nature of being something built with code, there are bugs that come up from time to time, and this is a great place to report bugs, to participate in helping solve bugs, to triage things, to suggest features, all that kind of stuff. Again, this is the Markdoc repo, and within the Markdoc repo, it's kind of interesting to see. You can go back through the commit history and see how it was built. You're welcome to contribute. I have my teammates at Stripe who are typically most active in this are some of the folks on our open source team that I work with fairly regularly. You'll see Mike Fix shows up there quite a bit. At any rate, this is something that we would love to have you to contribute to. We would love to also see what your thoughts are for extending this or other use cases you might have for it. Places where you might want to extend this library are really interesting to me too. I'm, like I said, part of the developer advocacy team at Stripe, so it's sort of my job to go and investigate and see what devs are doing with things that Stripe makes, and so I'm really interested in hearing what you're doing as well. Kind of a parting thought before we go. I was kind of inspired by Scott's keynote this morning, Scott Hanselman's keynote. Generally, I try and tie this into my talks everywhere, somewhere. I didn't get that clever this time. Also, be good to each other. Like, this is an open source thing. It's hard to do these things. It's provided to the community for a general benefit of each other. And when you're contributing, do so openly and honestly and in good faith. And we're here to help each other out. And I'm super happy that you're all here to hang out with me. I'm super happy to be talking about Markdoc. This is where you can chase me down online again. There are a couple links here. I will put up, there's a big QR code for the slides for this that you can go and grab these from. I also have at the bottom here bit.ly/ATO Stripe office hours. Tomorrow I have a few office hours slots open. If you want to talk about Markdoc, if you want to talk about anything Stripe does that's sort of developer facing, I'm here to chat. I've got, I think, a bunch of 15-minute windows open tomorrow. You're welcome to come and catch me. I think I'll be in a meeting room down the hall from here.